Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Edinburgh Lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Aubrey Manning and is entitled Scotland's Place in Earth's History. I'm Leslie Yellowlees, and I'm Vice Principal and Head of the College of Science and Engineering here at the University of Edinburgh, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. I have to start, of course, with a couple of housekeeping issues. There are no planned fire alarms this evening, so if the alarm does sound, it's real. So please follow the university staff out of the building to the quad. And second, please can I ask you to make sure your mobile phone is on silent. Thank you. So to tonight's lecture. Tonight we're here in the Playfair Library Hall of the University of Edinburgh. This room was designed by William Playfair, hence its name, in 1816 and was part of the university library until 1967 when the George Square Library was opened and students decanted there. It's now used for formal dinners, for receptions, for examinations, and for lectures such as the one tonight. Our lecture tonight is part of the popular Edinburgh Lecture series, which this year takes as its theme, Scotland Naturally. It is the first in the 21st series of such lectures, and it will be delivered by Professor Aubrey Manning, who is Emeritus Professor of Natural History at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Manning holds a degree in zoology from University College London and a doctorate from Oxford. He came to Edinburgh in 1956 as an assistant lecturer, gaining the chair in natural history in 1971. He's recognised as one of the country's leading authorities on animal behaviour and has inspired countless students and researchers with his enthusiasm and his passion for his subject. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, holds a number of honorary degrees, a Zoological Society of London Silver Medal, and was awarded an OBE in 1998. I would now ask Professor Manning to present his lecture, Scotland's Place in Earth's History. Aubrey, thank you.
Vice Principal, ladies and gentlemen, it's very nice to, an honour, to be batting for the university, as it were, in this Edinburgh series. It's not too bad either to be going first in the series, because I notice the feedback forms you have, at least you won't be able to put on them not as good as last week. Well, in my retirement, in quotation marks, I seem quite often to find myself giving talks which have very pretentious titles. This is pretty much an example of that. And I excuse myself because I want to move across quite a lot of material. And it's obvious, as Leslie said, that my subject was animal behaviour, which is not going to feature widely in the lecture tonight. So I am straying outside my field of expertise, and I'm well aware, acutely aware, that there will be people here who know more about each individual bit of the subject that I'm going to talk about. I'm certainly not going to talk exclusively about Scotland, but the point being that I had the great fortune to be picked up by the BBC to meet with and present the work of earth scientists. And that opened my eyes in a big way. And it's changed my whole attitude towards biology. So I don't feel too bad about moving outside the field of animal behavior. I think it's enormously important that the biological sciences and the earth sciences are taught and thought of together. So I'm going to begin unashamedly with the solar system, though I won't linger there very long. But to me, the story of Earth's history and Scotland's part in it is extraordinarily romantic. It's beautiful and it's quite wonderful. And I think it's important for us to understand it because I think it's highly relevant to what we, our species, will do in the future. As a long-term English immigrant, I have constantly, increasingly been aware of how this small country has contributed, particularly to earth sciences. It's absolutely astonishing. And I want to mention Scots as I go along, obviously. The first one is a very familiar Raeburn portrait, James Hutton. It was he who gave us the concept of deep time. And his theory of the Earth, 1797, I think, was one of the sort of formative volumes for human understanding of the Earth. He didn't write very well, James Hutton. It's pretty deadening prose, which he sends to us. And luckily, he had an excellent interpreter in the form of John Playfair, who was the professor, first of all, of natural philosophy, but then also including geology in this university, who was the uncle of the man who designed this glorious room. And I just want to quote you what John Playfair said when he went with James Hutton down to Sicker Point. We're lucky, 25 miles down the coast is this place, which is one of the absolute iconic spots for geologists the world over. What Playfair said was this: on us who saw these phenomena, the phenomena which one saw here was that there are vertical rocks here overlaid, eroded and overlaid by horizontal rocks. On us who saw these phenomena for the first time, the impression will not easily be forgotten. The palpable evidence presented to us gave a reality and substance to the theoretical speculations. What clearer evidence could we have had of the different formation of these rocks and of the long interval which separated their formation, had we actually seen them emerging from the bosom of the deep? The mind seemed to grow giddy from looking so far into the abyss of time. That's the most beautiful passage, I think. And the abyss of time is something which we owe to Hutton. Hutton, as you know, said at the end, we see no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Well, it wasn't just Hutton. Charles Lyell, who followed Hutton and developed perhaps the first substantial textbook on the modern geology, was a highly influential figure, born in Scotland. He worked a lot elsewhere, great influence on Darwin. And there are later Scots as well. I'll come to them, James Croll and Thomas Jameson. I'll come to them later. But I said that we would start with the solar system. And here we are, and I put up two bits of it, the Sun and Jupiter. You've probably heard the phrase that Earth is the Goldilocks planet because it's just about the right size, just about the right distance from the Sun, so that it keeps liquid water on the surface and has done so for 4 billion years plus. Okay. Well, the Sun is also the Goldilocks star because it's a medium-sized star, as stars go, and that means that it's got a very long lifespan. For reasons that I'm not competent to describe to you, if it were larger or smaller, it would live for a less length of time, and therefore our chances of getting going would have been less. We're also lucky in having Jupiter there, a gigantic planet about 300 times the size of the Earth, but still 0.1% of the size of the Sun. The Sun may be a medium-sized planet, but it's very, very large. Jupiter is about 0.1% of the Sun, and luckily it's big enough to have swept up, by its very powerful gravitational field, swept up quite a lot of the circulating debris that was there in the origins of the solar system. As we know, just recently, it didn't sweep up quite all of them. That amazing shot from Russia, where apparently lots of people have television cameras on the roof of their car because they film themselves so that they can cop out of any accidents they get involved with and so on. That was an extraordinary sight to see that meteorite. That's twice in a row, as you might say, the big meteors have hit that part of the planet. There was an earlier one in 1910. Anyway, Jupiter did most of that work for us. And so we've remained fairly tranquil for about 4.5 billion years. Now, the Earth is a dynamic planet, unlike the others. We've got dynamic Earths just down the road by Holyrood there, and that is well named. Most of the other planets are more static. Jupiter's fairly active on the surface, but some of them are completely static. Mars, I mean, described as a dead world, certainly dead now, may not have been, we'll know fairly soon. But Earth is in a dynamic state. As we know, its atmosphere is highly active and contains many reactive gases. How do we manage to keep oxygen, going in equilibrium around on the planet? It's life that does that, and more of that later. Well, what we know about the way in which the Earth's dynamism is well illustrated was originally put to us in a formal way by Alfred Wegener, an extraordinary man, a meteorologist, and it's appropriate that this stamp is from Greenland because Wegener is in Greenland. He was lost on the ice cap trying to get across it in the early 1930s, I believe. But he was the first man to propose in a serious way that the continents moved. Now, plate tectonics is so familiar to us now. It's taught in primary schools, isn't it? That the planets, the continents, the plates on which the continents sit, have moved across the Earth's surface. Here, 225 million years ago, and here at the present day. That is such a recent idea. When I was learning zoology back in the 1940s and 50s, Wegener, we knew about him, but we dismissed him. There was no mechanism by which the continents could move that was known of, and so we were told we have to go back to concepts of land bridges and changes in sea level accounting for the distribution of animals and plants across this surface. He was a heretic, Wegener, who's turned out to be establishment. And we should really look at our heretics today and check out which of them are really nuts and which of them actually will be tomorrow's establishment. It's worth bearing in mind. Now, Scotland's place in this, we should come back to the first time we can really identify a bit of the crust which is Scotland. It's about 500 million years ago when a bit of the Eurasian, as it now is, plate broke away, Avalonia. And it linked up about 500 million years ago with a bit from Laurentia, the Canadian, North American plate. And you see here that the line between the two plates roughly cuts off Scotland, about half of Ireland. They came together about 500 million years ago, and at that time were way, way south of the equator. Because Scotland's journey across the planet has been one of moving right up from the southern hemisphere into the northern hemisphere, and we're still moving north. So, in the Carboniferous period, about 325 million years ago, something like that, when Arthur's Seat was an active volcano, we were well south of the equator, and this was the kind of scene which one might have seen outside here. A Carboniferous forest. All these are relatives of the living tree ferns and club mosses and horsetails, but of gigantic size. And there were enormous dragonflies kicking around. The insects really got going in this Carboniferous period. But this was the time, of course, when Scotland's coal measures were laid down. All of this collapsed, rotted away, and has yielded the wealth of Scotland through the Industrial Revolution. Now, interestingly, if you go down to Barnes Ness on the East Lothian coast, here's the lighthouse, there is a geological park here. This is a bit of Carboniferous limestone here. You can see coal measures, but out here on these flattened rocks, you can see a series of remarkable, very symmetrical pits. Those are the root bowls, or the trunk bowls, of those great club mosses that I saw before. It's an extraordinary link back to the past. And again, a rather unique site. There's nowhere else that they're preserved so well. There are one or two bits of club moss trunk in the park in Glasgow, which you may have seen. But this is the place where you really can see the remains of a Carboniferous forest. Now, Scotland's moving north. We've passed through the equator, and in Permian ages, which are about 290 million years ago, we are going through the Saharan latitudes. We're about 10, 15, 20 north. And in Sahara now, many areas have got these extraordinary sand dunes, barkhans they're called. The wind blows in this direction, and the loose sand is taken off the top and forms crescents on each side. There are hundreds of thousands of these crescentic dunes, and they move gradually in this direction. I was amazingly struck staying at a hotel on the east coast of Arran to find that on the beach outside there is a fossilized barkhan. Not a very big one, but you can really see it. It's a most extraordinary sight, and that was Scotland when we were at Saharan latitudes. Now, we were moving north all through the later periods. After the Permian comes the Mesozoic, and that's the great age of reptiles, when the glorious dinosaurs were coming into full flood. And there are a few dinosaur bits and bobs around in Scotland, a very famous find on the east coast of Skye, and so on. Scotland moving north still, and I'm going to jump in time up to the beginning of the Tertiary. That's about 65 million years ago. And that's a crucial time because that's the time when the great meteorite hit the Gulf of Mexico. And there's great controversy, but many people still believe that this triggered the end of the age of reptiles. That this colossal explosion with the darkness, the pollution, the heat, the fires which it engendered, was the coup de grace for the great reptiles. Others vehemently dispute that and say that the meteor arrived about 300,000 years too soon, and you have to account for the death of the dinosaurs in other ways, perhaps by volcanic activity in India and so on. One of the things I love as a tyro, getting outside and reading the jazzy bits of earth science, is to recognize that there are really vehement controversies going on. I mean, there's quite a lot of human aggro goes on in these discussions, I can tell you. And that still continues here. As a biologist looking in, one can say, well, okay, the dinosaurs became extinct, but it wasn't like that. We know that the dinosaurs, they were declining anyway, and some of them hung around for probably 1 million years. Now, forgive me, to me, now I've got so much psyched into the geological way of thinking, 1 million years to me is a fairly short time scale. But think of it, it's 1,000 millennia. So there's controversy, but anyway, at the end of the Tertiary, the dinosaurs went out. 65 million years they went out. And about that time, quite clearly, something was acting, a big disturbance in the Earth's mantle, the semi-molten bit above the core, and a great plume of heat came up from the core and began to break the surface. It broke the surface and began to rift open the solid bit, which is now the North Atlantic. And incidentally, it formed Iceland along the way. It's still operating. But anyway, this was a time when Scotland was a centre of violent volcanic activity. On the west coast of Mull, you can see fantastic igneous rocks. They're multicoloured, hasn't come out at all well in this picture. But what does come out here is this cliff. Can you see up here, there looks to be a series of steps almost. And moving on to the shore, you see, when I first saw this, I thought, who on earth would build a wall down here? Who on earth would build such a wall? That is 65, well, a bit less, 60 million years old. It's a volcanic sill, and what's happened here is that the intense volcanism has pushed up molten rock between the cracks in the limestone pavement here. So at this time, Scotland was the equivalent of Iceland today, intensely volcanically active. And this same volcanism laid down the great basaltic displays, art displays of Staffa and the Giant's Causeway. It was a very active area. Well, I want to deal a bit later with some of the other geological events which have been crucial in the formation of Scotland, of natural Scotland as the lecture series is concerned. But I want just to digress a bit to think about this man and his ideas. James Lovelock, his entry in Who's Who, the first two words are independent scientist. And there couldn't be a better description of the man. He's never had a formal academic job. He's never had more than a consultancy with any of the various agencies with which he's worked. He's an inventor. He makes lots of things, as it were, in the shed at the bottom of his garden. And these things have been of immense importance in our understanding of the solar system and Earth's position in it. A quite brilliant man. He was awarded the Edinburgh Science Medal a few years back. Anyway, you'll have probably heard his name in relation to the Gaia hypothesis. He and William Goulding, the novelist, were walking along in the roads of Cornwall, and Lovelock was expounding his views on the way in which the Earth has the properties of a self-regulatory system. And it supports life, and life supports it. And what should I call this model? And Goulding said, well, Gaia, the Greek goddess of plenty. And it stuck. Now, his theory in a nutshell is this, or not his theory, his model. And I have no trouble at all with this. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? This, I wouldn't quite word it that way, I suppose. I've got some quibbles. My reasons being that without life, Earth would have no trouble continuing until the sun burns up the orbit of Mercury. But without the Earth, life, I think, would have some trouble. So it's not quite as symmetrical as this, but the effects are certainly both ways. And I'll start with the role of life in supporting the Earth or operating on the Earth. I think it was first brought home to me most directly by going to these extraordinary iron formations in the west of Australia. The entire Japanese car industry is run from northwestern Australia. The ships continuously cart this rock across, and parts of this rock are as much as 60% iron. It's very high-grade iron ore. Where's it all come from? It's come from these deposits were laid down on the seabed something over 2 billion years ago. When the Earth was young, huge amounts of the heavy elements that made up the Earth were coming out into solution in the oceans, and a lot of it came out as ferrous iron. If you remember from your chemistry set days, I remember most vividly, ferrous sulfate, pale green crystals, is very soluble in water. But if you oxidize that, it turns to ferric sulfate, which is insoluble and gets deposited. And this is all ferric oxides of one sort, and there'll be some ferric sulfate in there, I'm sure, as well. But where did the oxygen come from? The seas were at first anoxic until life of a particular sort got going. And these were the cyanobacteria, the first bacteria that solved the problem of how to use the sun's energy to fix carbon dioxide and water and generate more complex organic molecules, photosynthesis. Oxygen is a byproduct, and indeed was poisonous to many of the organisms initially. But the oxygen got into the seawater. It oxidized the ferrous salts into ferric salts, and iron started getting deposited. That's represented by these colossal deposits, not just in Australia, there are many places. So that is life affecting the Earth in a big way. And always, the photosynthetic bacteria are the earliest, well, I wouldn't call them ancestral plants as we know them, they're bacteria, but they are using a system which is incorporated, quite literally actually, into plants today. But another way, I'm thinking of life affecting the Earth, just this lovely river valley, I think it's the River Esk actually. If you look at that, you can see how the living crust is affecting the rocks. The roots are going down, breaking up the rocks. The water is rushing away and wearing away these, through these cracks. Soil is being deposited in leaf litter. Organic material is gathering. Life is affecting the whole structure of the planet. It does this across the entire Earth's surface in the temperate and tropical regions. Huge effects, the formation of soils upon which so much of the rest of life depends. So that river valley is another example of life affecting the Earth. These are foraminifera, little minute marine organisms, partly foraminifera, partly called coccoliths, and they build little shells. A single cell lives inside here, and they build little shells of calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate. They live in the sea in countless myriads. When they die, their little skeletons subside down to the surface. They get compressed layer upon layer upon layer, and we end up with chalk. And just think of how chalk has affected the structure of the planet. We don't have much chalk in Scotland, I'm afraid. I believe there's a tiny bit on Arran. I've never found it out. But I grew up in the south of England, and chalk is very, very important, socially, emotionally, psychologically to us, as well as structurally. We love chalk landscapes. And here is the old Harry rocks, which would originally have been linked up with the Needles on the Isle of Wight, and out here's dear old Swanage. This whole landscape, which extends over much of the south of England, up into the Lincolnshire wolds, across the Channel, the Pas de Calais, it becomes covered there by later clays, and it emerges in the Crimea. Huge amount of landscape rock produced by life. And if I tell you that a giant in these coccoliths, an absolute giant, would be 2 millimeters across, you might like to calculate on the back of an envelope how many coccoliths there are in the chalk. Life affecting the Earth in an enormous way. Life, we're shifting now to the way in which Earth supports life, the other half of James Lovelock's formula. The way in which life has evolved has been profoundly affected by Earth's dynamics. And perhaps the most famous example of this is the Wallaces Line here, which he drew figuratively, between Bali and Lombok, just 15 miles apart, in the East Indies, in now Indonesia. And what we find is, and Wallace described this, is that on this side of the line, up here in Eurasia, we have cats, we have primates, we have all the familiar mammals of our part of the world. On this part, in Australasia, we have, first of all, very fewer mammals now, but we have marsupials, birds of paradise. There are no cats, there are no birds, there are no monkeys, and so on. And this is an extraordinarily abrupt change. And Wallace suggested in a letter to Darwin, really showing great prescience, facts like these force us to accept enormous changes in the surface of the Earth. He couldn't have had any idea. Wegener was not a distant figure. He couldn't have had any idea on how this came about. But of course, this is the Australasian plate, which very recently has pushed up against the Eurasian plate. And so the whole survival of the marsupials in their great luxuriance, as it then was, it's been reduced now, I'm afraid, in their great luxuriance was entirely due to the movements of the Earth. Without that, I suspect that very many of the marsupials would have disappeared. This is just to illustrate, being a zoologist, I can't resist these beautiful creatures. Here is on the Australasian side of Wallace's Line, the big herbivore, the red kangaroo, and here, this glorious creature is the gaur, one of the largest of the oxen of the Indian forests. Very rare now. It stands more than 6 feet at the shoulder. It's a big animal. This is a eutherian mammal. This is a marsupial. Totally dissimilar evolutionary histories because they've been apart on the Earth's surface until very recently. So here we have the, the plate tectonics. Again, I just wanted to point out one thing here, how this, the Earth begins to look more similar. Here's Africa rifting away from South America. This is beginning to look a bit like our world. Here's India going to move up here to push against Eurasia and raise the Himalayas in Tibet. Here's Australia down here. And here's the modern Earth. But one point which is, until very recently, about 9 or 10 million years ago, was that the Isthmus of Panama didn't exist. That's a very recent bit of the Earth's crust, uplifted volcanoes along there. That caused a great flurry in evolutionary terms because after about 100 million years of separate evolution, the South American fauna and the North American fauna had a way of getting together. And it was very largely, the South American one had become very specialized, a number of giant, one has to say rather lumbering creatures, giant sloths, giant anteaters and so on. And they didn't stand up well to particularly the modern cats. It was cats and wolves that really did for them. So this bridge hugely affected evolution again. Human evolution has also been greatly affected by the plate tectonics. These dots are of sites where hominid, human-like fossils have been found. And they're all the way down on the Great Rift Valley, which runs up through that side of Africa. And we know that that was rifting apart a few million years ago at a rather crucial time. And the east of Africa became rather separated from the west of Africa. Now, of course, you could complain here, this could be a bit like, these fossils are difficult to find. And you might argue it's a bit like the drunk man looking under the lamppost for his car keys, which he's dropped. He doesn't know that he dropped them there, but it's the place that he can see, so he's looking there. Well, this is actually a rather easy place to do paleontology, but it's nevertheless, it is, all of us believe it's more than a coincidence. And this has had a profound effect on our early ancestry. I'll come back to that later. But, as I said, there's a bit more of planetary dynamics, which is much more directly relevant to Scotland. Ice. It is ice which has shaped so much of that which we see around us here. You think of the great glacier that swept in from the west and pushed up against the hard plug of the Castle Rock, left it standing and left that tail of debris as it swept past north and south of the Castle Rock, and the great tail which went down towards Holyrood Palace. I mean, that is, the work of the ice is just all around us here in Edinburgh. Ice has been a profound influence upon Scotland, well, the north of Europe in general. Now, there have been periods. This is Earth's history really compressed in not a very good diagram, the best one I could find. This is 2.5 billion years ago, about halfway through Earth's current history. And marked in are periods where we know there were great periods of cold on the Earth. This one here, about 2,300 million years ago, possibly is the one that's been called Snowball Earth, when the entire Earth virtually froze up. And life, which was only microbial at that time, had a pretty tough time of it. But there have been other such periods, and if we go along here through into the more recent times, I would say, 500 million years ago, big complicated animals and plants around. And look here, in the current time, it's been much warmer than now, but there have been periods of extreme cold, and we are in what geologists would call an ice age at the moment. Now, of course, that means it's relatively cold, but there are intermittent periods of extreme freeze-up. And usually these freeze-ups are related to what's called the Milankovitch cycle. Milankovitch was a Serbian mathematician who began to calculate, he added the finer points of calculations of how the energy reaching the Earth from the sun has fluctuated because the Earth's inclination towards the sun has fluctuated and our orbit has also fluctuated. We've sometimes been more elliptical and sometimes more circular. Milankovitch did these correlations and showed that about every 40,000 years there was a lapse of energy or a reduction in energy reaching the Earth, enough, he thought, to cause the freeze-ups. And although there are many complications of this picture, in general, that picture remains true. What I want to draw attention to is that 50 to 100 years before Milankovitch got going, this man worked out these energy cycles. James Kroll. Now, to me, he is the archetypal lad of Pertz. I can't resist quoting just a little bit about Kroll. James Kroll was born in 1821 on a farm, Little Whitefield, near Wolf Hill in Perthshire. He was largely self-educated, teaching himself physics and astronomy. At 16, he became an apprentice wheelwright, and then, because of health problems, a tea merchant in Elgin. In the 1850s, when he's in his 30s, he managed a temperance hotel in Blairgowrie and was then an insurance agent in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Leicester. In 1859, the age of 39, he became a caretaker in the museum of the Andersonian College and Museum in Glasgow, so as to have access to books to allow him to develop his ideas. He spent the evenings, he was on the night watch, reading the books in the Andersonian library. And he began to work out the Kroll cycles. By 1876, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. Could you have a more classic example of a lad of pets. I mean, who would have thought that the apprentice wheelwright is going to solve one of the great issues in the history of our planet? There it is. That's James Kroll. Now, he's been vindicated, and Milankovitch also. I don't want to diminish Milankovich's contribution. Here we look at thousands of years before the present, and if we look at temperature here, we see it's got these roughly 40,000 year cycles. And we're in the middle of we've come out of the cold about 20,000 years ago. We're getting warmer, but we should be due to go back down again fairly soon. But of course, carbon dioxide, because one species of mammal is using rather a lot of it, is going up very rapidly, and that will have an effect. But that's not relevant to what I'm saying at the moment. Okay, there are the Kroll-Milankovitch cycles. And ice, I just must digress, go a little bit abroad in the world, because the effect of these cycles, these glacial periods, has had some enormous, colossal, catastrophic effects on the surface of the Earth for very particular reasons. Here's an area in Washington State, the so-called dry falls seen from the air. And what we have is a couple of gigantic semicircular amphitheaters. And look at the surface of the land above. Great scouring ridges. If you go down here, hundreds and hundreds of square miles, the Pacific's out down there. You see this? Here is the land surface with these great gougings on it in this direction. And strewn around this landscape, there are gigantic boulders. Many of them the size of houses. Here is one of them, gives you an idea of the scale of it. An old American geologist in the 1920s and 30s, this was his field area where he went in the summer. It's not a very easy place to get to. It's quite remote. Rather few geologists have gone there, but old Harlen Bretz went there. And he was trying to interpret what he saw here. And of course, at that time, and indeed ever since Huttonian times, if you like, the general feeling was that most geological landscapes were produced very gradually. People regarded them as uniformitarian, that, as Hutton described, rocks are laid down gradually, worn away gradually. It's all a gentle, gradual process whereby immensely slow events carried on over an immense time will nevertheless produce big changes. But Bretz had great trouble interpreting this in sedimentary, gradual terms. And he began to think, this looks as if it's been scoured by water. How else are you going to move these rocks? He had great trouble convincing his colleagues, but at one meeting that he went to, I think it was in Chicago in the late 1920s, one man came up to him and said, I think I know where that water may have come from. The point was is you needed an awful lot of water. And what his colleague realized was that during the last ice age, well, one of the last ice ages, a huge lake had been dammed up in Upper Montana, Lake Missoula. And that as the ice retreated, there would come a point at which suddenly the great ice dam would break. And suddenly, immense quantities of water would be released all at once. And in fact, Bretz's view is that this landscape was probably carved out in a week. The estimates of the volume of water are that all the rivers of the world put together were suddenly released. And somebody's described, there were human beings kicking around at this time, and somebody's described what it must have been like. You would be out here and you would feel an unusual wind. Why is the wind blowing? And then too late you would see that a wave of water, probably 30 meters high, was bearing down you. A lot of our ancestors would have lost their lives then. But it seems quite certain that that's what happened. And the scablands, you can imagine the house-sized boulders careering at maybe 50, 60 miles an hour across this landscape. Every time I see this, I think, well, I know we've got these windmills, and it's pretty useful, I suppose, but air is very thin stuff. A 10-mile-an-hour wind, you wouldn't really notice it. A 10-mile-an-hour wave would knock you off your feet. Rocks like this are tossed around as if they were corks. Good thing if we try to get energy out of the water, rather more than we're trying at the moment. Well, I know we are trying, but we should push that harder. Anyway, if we look elsewhere in the world, Malham Cove in Derbyshire, a semicircular waterfall, now completely dry, formed by the release of an ice dam further up. Our own Glenroy, the parallel roads here, not so dramatic in the forms of the landscape, but there must have been some fair floods when the ice dam, which had held the water at this level, suddenly collapsed, and a vast amount of water was released. Ditto here. You remember old Darwin talked about changing sea levels here. In fact, he was not quite right. It was a glacial lake which had been dammed at 3 different levels, and they were subsequently released. So my point is that the ice has produced huge and very dramatic changes. Now I want to conclude, move back to thinking about humans in Scotland, our own self here. And the first point I want to make is that one of the things I get infuriated about is when the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, it's usually them, come up and talk about the missing link has been found. We all know what the missing link is supposed to be, the link between us and the apes. Well, it's absolute nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. We have an embarrassment of intermediate fossils, and your guess is as good as mine as to which one is the direct ancestor. Everybody who finds a new fossil will, of course, say, this is the direct ancestor. Well, they have to do that, don't they? But this, 6 million years ago, this is roughly when we split from the chimpanzee. And after that, there are a lot of different types of hominid, one calls them. Animals, people related to ourselves, Australopithecines of different types. Coming up to the present, we see that we get the genus Homo coming in, particularly Homo ergaster, about 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo Sapiens, and Homo neanderthalensis, quite related. We think that the Neanderthal man was probably the common ancestor of these two, but there are some real mysteries still. First of all, there's this little animal person, the hobbit, found on the island of Flores in the East Indies. Nobody would have possibly predicted that such a person, a creature, had existed. Stood about a metre and a bit high, had a very small brain, smaller than a chimpanzee, but a very human style of brain. What on earth were they like? They were there 12,000 years ago. And my point is that we live in splendid, dominating isolation now, don't we? Homo sapiens. But 50,000 years ago, there were 1, 2, 3, 4, and probably now a 5th species of Homo. There were 5 species of humanoid on the planet. What on earth would we have made of them? The only 2 that we know must have met, or it seems almost certain they must have met, are of course Sapiens and Neanderthalensis. But whether they hybridized, whether they competed directly, or whether they just Neanderthals were on their way out anyway because the climate was changing adversely for them, very difficult to know. Anyway, the part of Britain that we know about is known to anthropologists and paleontologists, the Costa del Crema, which is down there on Norfolk near the, I think, fairly boring holiday resort of Croma. And there are these cliffs which consist of soft glacial tills. What we have here are the remains of gravel, which have been, and sand and little boulders are pushed off the earth by repeated glacial advances and retreats on that 40,000-year cycle. Go back about 7 of them here at least. And this is a very rapidly eroding cliff. I mean, when you're walking along this beach, you don't think about, oh, there was a landfall here 15 years ago and it's going away. You look at what came down the night before. It is eroding very rapidly. Do not buy property up on this cliff top, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, here's the Costa del Crema. And during the warm periods, the interglacials, during this last couple of million years, we know that Homo Heidelbergensis, big humanoid with a brain of about 1,000 milliliters. Ours is about 1,250 to 1,300. So a pretty brainy person, but very massively built. And we know from Croma and elsewhere wonderful sites in which they were making these handaxes. Some of them are remarkably skillfully made. You can see a big piece of flint has been chipped away to form an implement. And these implements are used for cutting and for tearing. And it was, if you like, the high tech of that period. We're talking of 650, 700,000 years ago. This was one of our ancestors living in the south of the British Isles. Anyway, we've no such remains from Scotland. They may have been there, not been found yet, but they certainly, this was during relatively warm periods. And at Box Grove, near Chichester, there is one wonderful site, because there, we know Heidelbergensis, we got a shin bone from there, and these handaxes were being made. There are remains of them everywhere. And you imagine this 700,000-year-old humanoid sitting with a reindeer skin or a deer skin over his lap, chipping away. You would have something on your lap to take up the fragments. And you make yourself a fairly good, you're working away, maybe for an hour or two, very skillfully, making this hand axe, and then you stand up. And as you stand up, the fragments fall off your lap onto the ground. They have found such a place. And they actually show that the fragments come from the same stone. So it really is a link 750,000 years ago to the workings of a humanoid at that time. I mean, that's what I mean by it being romantic. I think it really is quite extraordinary how we have discovered this and what it means in our history. Now, during warm periods, there were some exotic creatures in the Costa del Crema. First of all, and we know this was widespread, and also in Scotland, hyenas and lions. The hyena was very much like the spotted hyena today. The lion was bigger than the current lion. There was this extraordinary elephant relative, Stegodon. And we know that Heidelbergensis, some of these bones have got scratch marks on them where they've been butchered with these flint implements. Woolly rhinoceros and cave bear. If you were going into a cave at that time, you wanted to be fairly sure whether it had any previous occupants. This gives you the scale. This bear, of course, like bears do, would rise up on its hind legs to work. It's a very big animal indeed. But then the ice would come back, and in the cold periods, human beings disappeared, very largely. Mammoths, muskox, reindeer, and this wonderful creature, Irish elk. I always think it's a good thing because as a zoologist, one learns that all the biggest fossils tend to be found in North America. I mean, the biggest dinosaurs and so on and so forth. The biggest deer was found in the British Isles. And there's been no deer that bigger, this gigantic sweep, 12 feet of antlers. It grew them afresh each year. They must have weighed a couple of hundredweight. Think of the neck muscles. Okay, Homo sapiens arrives about, well, a bit prior to 35,000 years ago, probably. I show you this picture, it's a rotten slide, I'm sorry, because this is Goat's Hole here, and I've been up there. This is at high tide. At low tide, you can get down and scramble up these rocks. The oldest, at the time, the oldest Homo sapiens skeleton found anywhere was found in Goat's Cave in 1823. It's the representative of Cro-Magnon man. Now, they found older ones since then, but it's still the oldest decorated skeleton. What I mean by decorated is that he, because it was a he, was called the Red Lady of Paviland. The bones that were found in here were covered in ochre, probably decorative ochre, and there were beads made of glycerina, of periwinkle shells, and also walrus and mammoth ivory around as well. This was an advanced, probably a prince who was buried there. And I've been up into that cave, and it's quite remarkable to sit there and see the clearing the place where this skeleton was laid, probably with high ceremony, 33,000 years ago, and stayed there unseen until 1823. It's a remarkable story. Anyway, the ice was coming back, and by that time, the ice would have appeared over the hills, the sea levels would have gone down markedly, and human beings had to move off across the Bristol Channel, which would have been dry land then, and they could have walked across to Europe. And they had to do so, and the British Isles were uninhabited for 10,000 years. No trace of human activity for 10,000 years. Here, I don't know whether any of you have been to the snout of a glacier. I found this a remarkably fascinating place to be. It gave you some picture of what our ancestors were putting up with at this time. Here is the snout of this great glaciers in the Swiss Alps, coming from mountains up above here. This is a retreating glacier. It's going back. So what we are seeing is how sterile all the land is around. Human beings chasing back as the ice retreated. And of course, they couldn't go back in any long-term way until plants had got back there. It would have to be trees and then the animals which would have gone back. Plants are always in the lead. We know that the climate has changed a great deal and is still changing. And we know it's highly variable. The debate continues, but this quote from Wally Burker is, I think, highly relevant to our present situation. At the last time that this glacial exchange took place, there were probably no more than a few thousand, at the most tens of thousands, of human beings in the British Isles. There's now 63 million of us, and a lot of us are living very close to the sea. So we should not look back and say, oh, climate change, the climate's always changed. Yes, indeed it has, but we have not been around that much longer. Now, these are the people who came back. I mean, this is Skara Brae, and I always think this is such a wonderful place to see. It's about 5,000 years before present. It predates the Great Pyramids of Egypt. I always think, well, it's so modern, this place. You can imagine somebody arranging things on those shelves and sweeping the floor, and that's where you went to bed, in there. It's incredible. These people are 5,000 years before us, but they are us. If you took a young Skara Braean and brought them in here, they'd be playing with their computer games within 15 minutes. So, many exotic animals, the ice sweeping in, and the forests too. And of course, one of the first things that we did, cutting down the forest, was to get rid of the big predators. Well, this one didn't go to the 18th century. I'm not too sure about lynx. And as you know, there's a debate going on about what we should do about this. I don't think we can ever reintroduce wolves here, but wonderful to have that glorious creature back again. This is the kind of environment that you feel they would have been moving up into. And this is Rothymercus. And there is this picture of the great wood of Caledon. But we should remember, and Christopher Smoughton, in his wonderful book, Nature Contested, points out that the pine forest was only ever large in the east. The west of Scotland is too wet for pine forest, and where the Norway spruce, which grows well in wet climates, didn't get back across here after the last glacial retreat. So we've, that is planted artificially, and of course Sitka spruce also does very well in wet climates. Much more difficult to establish Scots pine, but there are wonderful tracts of it still. We've got used to our wonderful bare hills, but they are, of course, we love them, but they are, of course, completely unnatural. Here is overgrazed hillside, and the trees are just creeping up where the sheep and the deer can't get. I just want you to go, if you've not been, to Corypheran Wildwood, just south of the Greymare's Tail on the road to Moffat, because there a group linked to the Borders Wildlife Trust, Borders Forest Trust, have developed a wonderful scheme. Public, many people, hundreds of people, bought this whole valley, goes up to White Coombe, about 820 metres here, and they're replanting it, and they're going to re-establish the forest as it was 6,000 years ago. They picked on 6,000 years ago because a yew bow, the remains of a bow, was found in the peat up here, which was dated at 6,000 years before present. It was a broken bit of bow, and you know what happened. One of our ancestors was up there hunting and drew on the deer, possibly even a reindeer, and the bow broke, and there was a Neolithic expletive, which was sounded on the air then, and he threw the bow down. And we picked it up later. But look, millions of trees have been planted, and this is coming back. Just going to be one bit of recreated early Scotland. They're not going to harvest it, it's going to be left. Okay, sorry. How are we reacting to Scotland today? I really am coming to a close. Well, some things we accept. There's been all this history, of course, of land ownership, land use in Scotland, the dispossession of agricultural people, the importing of sheep, the worship of deer and grouse and pheasants, the re-establishment of public ownership in the Highlands, all of those things. And some things we are changing, our attitude is changing completely. Here is the flow country in northeastern Scotland, which at one time we thought was good for planting trees, and fountain forestry were selling off great lumps of it to pop stars who were investing their millions in that. We now know that that's not the best way to use this, and there is a colossal carbon sink here. If we get rid of the flow country, my goodness me, the carbon dioxide figures are going to rise very steeply. So we have changed in that way. We are changing. But I leave you with these two quotes, which to some extent appear to be conflict with one another. James Hutton, the uniformitarian, that as we see what's happening in the world in the present, geologically speaking, rivers eroding away, mountains being worn, glaciers rising and falling, we see that we can understand the past from looking at the present. But of course, for us as human beings living in a complex modern society of Scotland, we have to think much more about where we're going. And Edmund Burke, forgive me for quoting an old Irishman to conclude with, I think says it all. This is the message which I think we should have. Of course, our trouble is that we have only plan A, which is sustained growth until, well, the Earth envelops Mercury. Biologists know that's not possible, but we don't have a plan B. And maybe the history of Scotland helps us to see our place in the solar system and recognize that we have limitations. We mustn't take it for granted. I leave you with books which I found useful and fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aubrey. That was a tour de force indeed. We have got some time for questions. Because we're filming this, could you wait until the microphone, the roving mic, comes for you, to you? There it is at the back, it's ready. So, questions?
Somebody there?
Oh, yes.
Hi. As a fellow zoologist, just picking up on something that you barely touched, but I'm just kind of interested. You were talking about how you think it could be possible to reintroduce the Scottish lynx, but not the wolves, and I was wondering if you had any story behind that.
Well, the wolf has been much more in the public eye. As you probably know, there have been repeatedly, certainly for the last 25, 30 years, groups who have been advocating the release of wolves. We have a problem with deer in the Highlands of Scotland. As an ardent conservationist, I'm absolutely against this because I think it would set back the cause of conservation enormously. The situation isn't as it was, and there's no way we could get public acceptance of the release of wolves. Largely, I think that would be unjust. Wolves, it's still, if you can quote me a case where wolves have attacked human beings, I want chapter and verse. There are none such, to my knowledge. But they would have a go. They're quite bright animals, and they would have a go for sheep and so on. They would. But I just don't think it's a practical issue. I think we have to accept that 100 years down the line, if we're still around, that might be possible. The lynx is completely different. It's a forest animal, extraordinarily shy. If we had lynx in Scotland, you'd be extremely lucky. The person who ever saw one would be really fortunate. I think they would, on a few occasions, they might break out and take some sheep which were fairly close to woodland edge, but for the most part they would not. They would hunt in woodlands, as they do in Scandinavia. They're an animal of such beauty, it would just be wonderful to have them around, as they were around until I think sometime in the 16th century. That's possible. And beavers, as you know, we've re-released, and some of them have been released irregularly and doing very well in Perthshire and Tayside, I believe. And we're trying other things, as you know. But I think you have to start from where we are. And I understand why people have a fear, which is irrational in my view, of wolves. And therefore I think we just have to accept it. You might get away with a pack of wolves on run.
You mentioned in passing historical, I think that it wasn't quite the word you used, heretics who are now regarded as producing fundamental, important discoveries. Who, in your view, are the current heretics which at some point in the future will be regarded as producing some fundamental insight that we don't yet grasp?
Gosh, that's a very difficult one. I mean, Lovelock is, in a sense, is a heretic himself, and he's developed very heretical views about the current position for energy, for instance. He believes that we will not get by in any reasonable way without going for nuclear power in a very big way. And he's completely hard-nosed about it. He says if we go for a massive development of nuclear power, a few hundreds of people will die as a result of that. If we don't go for nuclear power, millions of people will die because of conflict and so on. And I have to say, as somebody who 30 years ago stood up on the beach at Ness with a loud hailer preaching against the evils of nuclear power, I'm convinced by him. I think we do have to go for nuclear power. But his views also about the planet and the possibilities of life on other planets, too, very, very interesting. As for other heretics, who is really preaching? I think probably it's economics heretics we want more at the moment, actually. I mean, we all know what we mean by Plan A, which is, Osborne and cut. But there are, of course, an equal number, virtually, of economists who argue that's the wrong way to go. And I would like to think there's a man, let me get his name right, I think Hamilton, in the University of Surrey in Guildford, who's written a very interesting book called Prosperity Without Growth, which he's an economist, and he addresses this problem directly. And of course, there have been many who've gone that way. And I really would like to see some heretical views coming in there. My own heretical view, which I have very carefully not shouted this evening, is that I think we need population control in a big way. And that is an issue that nobody will tackle. And I accept completely that we can't have it now, but I would simply like governments across the world to recognize that numbers count, that you can't just predict and provide. You have to say, look, there are too many people here. We want to do all we can to prevent any further growth. In fact, I think to degrow. But I know exactly what the feelings that this arouses, and I merely wish to say that I think human beings are nice, and I don't wish to have a cow.
Well, we're all relieved about that. Any other questions? Can I ask you about, we're continuously told that many species are under threat just now, and that, many have died out and many will die out. What's your view on the evolution of new species then? Do you think new ones are happening and we just haven't got them, recognized them yet, or what?
Yes, evolution doesn't stop. Some of the most obvious things that are happening, you're right, are that the species that we know and are familiar with are under big threat. Of course, they're particularly large animals, elephants, rhinoceros, the gaur, and so on. It's fairly easy for a biologist to predict which, if this sort of extinction that goes on now, habitat reduction, more and more pressure to raise food, and therefore to take over habitats that at present are in a relatively natural state, it's pretty easy to predict who will be the survivors. And they are changing, they are evolving. Foxes, cattle egrets, cockroaches, all of these are changing their behavior remarkably as a result of human activity. And there will be much evolution going on amongst soil insects who are able to cope with modern pesticides and so on. Much more difficult to spot them. It does take a long time this is always the question that the creationists bring up to Darwinians. Show me a species that's evolved. Well, you can certainly show how things have changed markedly, but whether you would call them a species depends on what the animals or plants would call a species. Certainly in plants, we've had new species arising quite spontaneously in our lifetime, usually through hybridizing of two other species. There are lots of white beam trees on the island of Arran, which are unique new species which have appeared since the clearances, which have forced white beams into the valleys, and new species which are isolated have now evolved. But that's not very satisfying. It's not what the general public feels about that. All one can say is that the loss of species is the order of the day. Estimates are that extinction is running now at about 1,000 times the rate in the fossil record. Species have always died out, you're right, but they're dying out now at an extraordinarily rapid rate. there's a huge sort of, I wouldn't call it a backlog. There are a huge number of species which have reached a fairly threshold level, and they're going to decline very markedly. I mean, we can all think of them. My particular totem is the Sumatran rhinoceros. I don't expect my children will ever see one, and so on. But life isn't going to go extinct. I mean, we may go extinct, it seems to me. It's not impossible, but life will survive.
On that cheerful, oh, sorry, yes, sir, the very back.
Thank you very much. I find myself, as always, in very broad agreement with what you say, but you do beg one or two questions, which obviously this isn't the place to go into them in detail, but I am very concerned by this focus on the question of population and the relentless increase, because I'm a little bit more concerned about the consumption of the world's resources, natural and otherwise, which, well, all natural, of course, by certain countries, and we seem to focus on that and not yet looking at other models whereby we can live in a degree of harmony with the resources that we have. I wonder if this question of population growth is really the core of the matter, rather than the way we actually live in this planet, which may in itself cause, in certain parts of the world, vast increases in population.
Well, of course, I agree with you. You come to me and say it's not population, it's greed, overconsumption, the lousy position of women in many countries of the world, inequality, poverty, and so on. That's absolutely okay. If I come to you, you will say that to me. I do not say it's not poverty, it's not greed, it's population. I say population, you say it's not population, it's so and so. There's an asymmetry in our views. What I'm suggesting is that what will not be sufficient is nevertheless absolutely necessary. I believe, as a biologist looking at the carrying capacity of the Earth, that we're already grossly overpopulated. And that certainly means Britain and the rich North, absolutely. I mean, I think that the best thing that could possibly happen for Britain would be a slow decline in our population over the next century or so. How is one to bring this about? How is one to change the attitudes? Of course we have to reduce consumption. Of course we have to reduce poverty. We have to get in societies where women are not able to have full control of their reproduction, get that and so on. We need all of that. But I don't think it's possible just to say it's not population, it's consumption. It's both. And that is a difficult message to get across because it seems anti-human, which is the absolute opposite of what it is. I think that humanity, in the broadest sense, will be the first victim of overpopulation stress. I mean, you can see it happening in Britain at the moment. Look at all the edgy things about Bulgarian immigrants with 10 children coming in and taking all this. That is all a part of this general feeling that Britain has got enough. A YouGov poll about 18 months ago asked people, would Britain be better with fewer, more, or about the same number of people? 1% said with more, 65% said with fewer. Now, read what you mean into that, but it is a pretty extraordinary disparity that a very large number of our fellow citizens think that Britain would be better with fewer people. That's a start. It's just a start. What the implications of that are, of course, get rather awkward. It means that when, posh Beckham has a fourth child, you don't have to gush quite as much, and so on. But that takes a lot of time. I'm not diminishing the problems.
I think at this period in time, the very thought in our minds of gushing at the Beckham's fourth child is a good time to stop. I have to say it was fabulous and it was a really fascinating lecture. And it's given us all, I'm sure, lots to think about and lots, I hope, to talk about both tonight and over the coming weeks, etc. I think we'll all find ourselves coming back to what you've talked about, Aubrey, tonight, and mulling over in our own minds how best we should deal with that information and how best that we can go forward. Because I do want to leave this place a better world for my children and for all our children. So could you join me all in thanking Aubrey? Before you do that, could I ask you all to fill in your questionnaires, because as Aubrey says, this is the first in the series of lectures, and it's the 21st series of lectures, and we would like there to be a 22nd, and your input is very valuable to us. So if you could fill the questionnaires in, I'd be very grateful. But please now join me in thanking Aubrey for a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.